And one more question, it has to deal with the boundary between art and mass culture and mass aesthetics. Critics of mass aesthetics say that it's simply superficial, that it's unidimensional, it doesn't allow for larger contextualizations.
Right.
Whereas art does, and that's sort of the appeal of art. Are these two different objects?
Well, I mean, the barrier between high art and low art is one I have a big problem even acknowledging the existence of, namely because as someone who grew up in a urban or a suburban area outside of Chicago, everything I've ever experienced has been on the mass art basis. I mean, I've listened to lots of Beethoven symphonies, but I got them free in the for joining the Book of the Month Club, which is about as mass art as you can get. I've heard Caruso, also on recordings I can buy at the record chains in the malls right next to, Bon Jovi and all of this. I mean, the sense that I don't feel like I have ever experienced high art, as there used to be the distinction when, in fact, to see a play, you had to go to the court and have an invitation from royalty and so forth. Or to read a book, you had to be one of the few people who were, in fact, literate and had enough money to buy, hand-scribed books to read. I mean, I think there was a real distinction between the high culture, which only certain people could get, and the low culture, which everyone else had to settle for. But now, I think everything that I perceive of as high art has always been distributed through mass art chains. I mean, sure, I may be watching Baryshnikov, so are millions and millions of other Americans, but somehow when they do it, they're feeling, I'm watching the ballet. This is high art that the rest of my inferiors aren't producing. And granted, more people have seen Gilligan's Island than may have seen Swan Lake, but there's still a sense that Swan Lake is a very mass-distributed art. So I think since the Industrial Revolution, and certainly now into the paperback revolution and videotape and cable distribution, where you can, the arts and entertainment network is the perfect, I think, melding of the high and low as one. You all get them from the same distribution centers, which you buy them at the bookstore in the mall, you buy them at the record store in the mall, you rent them at the tape store in the mall, or you turn on the television and have it delivered to you. So that whole high art, low art debate is one that I think is on some really shaky ground from the very beginning, in that I'm not even sure it exists anymore. The only real definition I would say you could make between high art and low art now is, if my students just like it, it's probably low art. If they don't, it's probably high art.
I think that it does seem interesting. If you would say 30, 40 years ago, as a professor for the county, or whatever, but in this country, instead I want to teach a course of theory and literature, they look at the idea.
There you go.
Mm-hmm. And you say go back by 6 years or 5 years, and say I want to teach a course on American literature, they look at you like you're crazy. We were saying the same thing about the culture.
Absolutely.
Is it just a question then of is its time coming?
I think so. I mean, I think it is that whole idea that academia wants to study only the things that have some sort of critical distance, and there's a certain, I think, usefulness to that, and it's very difficult to study the things that are right on top of us. The Modern Language Association was originally a radical association to sort of develop ways in which we could teach American literature in this country, so that we wouldn't have to just teach Latin and Greek and the classics and so forth. And to call them MLA radical now is, elicits peals of laughter. And now the PCA seems to be that next step, which, if we want to study toilet seats and cheeseburgers, it needs this new organization, because of course you can't get accepted at the MLA on a cultural history of those types of things. So I think eventually we will, as soon as the Brady Bunch becomes hard to watch, as soon as it requires annotations that, Jan's allergic to Tiger shampoo, and the word shampoo is no longer used that way in this culture, so one has to go back and read the footnote that shampoo was once a chemical product we put on our hair and so forth, then I think academia will like it again, because suddenly it requires hard work and the ferreting process that we think of as doing research and that sort of thing. And it's that whole idea that academics seem to think that if it's a lot of fun, and especially if the barbarian students think it's a lot of fun, somehow that by definition should keep it out of the groves of academia and in the realms of things that people consume that they don't have to pay tuition for.
This has an interesting distinction between public culture being essentially the pleasure of the body. It's rooted in that kind of immediate pleasure and practices and what have you. Whereas IR is something more cerebral and abstract. Do we need to get rid of those boundaries completely? Can there be a coexistence between the two? Or is it becoming more difficult in the context of modern world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would like to see those boundaries disintegrated, for one thing, because, as I said before, I don't think they really exist. I think they're still constructs we've got left over from an era long before I was born, not to mention work being done now. The idea, and that's one of the things that bothers me about a popular culture association, is it's become something of a ghetto, where if it doesn't fit into MLA, the Modern Language Association, or if it doesn't fit into the American Historical Association, so that everything that doesn't belong elsewhere can kind of go to PCA. It's like the Statue of Liberty is asking for, the poor, the untenured, the unable to publish type of thing. And that, I think, tends to continue to proliferate this idea of the low and the high, and we're studying the low, and even though we're saying positive things about its study, it's still, we're here doing it as opposed to the other places. And as far as the argument that the high is more abstract and cerebral, and that the popular is more sensual and body-oriented, I mean, I know a lot of people who read in bed, for example, very high art novels and so forth, which is a pretty, sensuous, the fireplace is going, and they may have, a cup of herbal tea next to the book and so forth. Music, I mean, symphonies, some of Beethoven's symphonies are about the most erotic, sensual pleasures of the body, I think, of any music that's ever been written. So I'm not sure I disagree with that distinction. I guess a lot of the distinction may be popular culture you can consume instantaneously without much previous education. To really appreciate high culture, because it's in a historical context, tends to take a little more education. I didn't appreciate symphonies until I sat through a couple classes that taught me how to do so. On the other hand, I think television can be enjoyed infinitely more than it's being enjoyed now, or the shopping mall, or the Big Mac, or the video arcade, by teaching classes in that as well. I mean, I really think hamburger appreciation wouldn't be out of line in our colleges. I mean, think of the amount of the number of times an average American or Canadian or British, any Western student eats in a fast food joint and never thinks about the ballet that's going on in front of them as things are being prepared. It never has any concept that there's only 6 shapes of McNuggets that are made to look irregular. I mean, there's this whole world of academic inquiry that could go on. When I go into McDonald's now, it's like going to Disney World. I mean, they're going to a museum or a library. I mean, it's an aesthetic experience that before I started studying those types of things was just going to McDonald's and eating some food.
Are we getting lost in the aesthetic pleasures, and perhaps not considering the ideological description going on?
Sure, I mean, that I think, and that is the second feature of what I teach, is I think it's always important to remember that all of these things are being put forth by an industry that is doing it to make a lot of money. My favorite example of this is the vibrating bed things at a motel, where we've all done them before. We all know they're not that pleasurable. They just make some noise and move the bed. But there's something about that slot that says place quarter here that instantaneously, when you walk into a motel, and I still do this, you reach your hand in your pocket, you yank out the quarter, you put it on there, and somehow you think you're being either clever or campy if you know what's going on, or if you're a young child, you do it because it's there to be done. That whole idea that all of these things are, designed to separate us from our income. And certainly, I think students need to be told that in television or in the mall or any of mainstream popular culture products, art and commerce are bedfellows, and commerce is always on top in that relationship. On the other hand, these things aren't going to go away, and I think there's a sense that there's a certain degree of cynical aesthetic appreciation we can have with them, which is, I think, part of the whole postmodern scene, which is this almost hopeless celebration of this sort of crazy aesthetics gone mad sort of situation. But you're right, the study of television, I think, is always going to put you between a political rock and an aesthetic hard place that we have to help students to navigate and try to help ourselves navigate as well, which we're certainly not always capable of doing.